So Al, greetings, and thank you for doing this with me today.
My pleasure.
I'm meeting with Professor Al Young, who is the third Al Professor of Sociology at the University of Michigan, and also Department Chair of this really spectacularly great Department of Sociology. I've gotten to know Al over the past 3-4 years, I would say, and have come to really admire the work that he does in sociology, the work that you do, Al. The book that I became the most enchanted with is your 2006 book, The Minds of Marginalized Black Men, Making Sense of Mobility, Opportunity, and Future Life Chances. Just an outstanding piece of work, and I believe a very innovative piece of work in sociology, one that really sheds a lot of light. So I'm really pleased that you're willing to talk a little bit today about the work that you do and kind of how it intersects with the progress that I think many of us think the discipline, the science of sociology needs to make as we move forward into the next 10 or 20 years. I've now done a handful of interviews, beginning with Chuck Tilley 3-4 years ago, and the late Mayor Zold did a super interview with me a couple of years ago. In each case, what I've asked the sociologist or the social scientist to reflect on is how his or her own career, the thinking that you've done about sociology, about research, about scientific knowledge of society, how that relates to kind of the future of the discipline and how some new thinking can actually lead to better results, better understanding of these complex processes that we're facing in the 21st century. There's some old-fashioned ideas about methodology in the social sciences, which are kind of positivist, kind of looking for general laws and regularities, which really seems very wrong-headed to me. Society isn't the right kind of thing to have, kind of governing laws or, something like laws of nature. And if we give up that sort of positivist idea, then what are some of the forms of knowledge which we can aspire to? And what are the most urgent things we need to know about social change and about contemporary society, but also about how we got here? Al has focused on issues of race and urban poverty. I don't know that you would call yourself an urban sociologist.
Well, I accept the title. I think of myself as slightly different than the traditional urban sociologist.
Exactly. And you're also a qualitative sociologist. So,
I do very much think of myself as a qualitative sociologist.
So much of the work that you do depends on having really in-depth interviews with young black men in the case of this book, and I think that's also a major part of a lot of other parts of your research.
More generally. Yes.
I see from looking at your CV that you've also got a couple of books coming out very soon, so that's also very exciting. So I thought we might begin by talking about the minds of marginalized black men. If you could just kind of describe to me what you were trying to accomplish and what you felt really importantly you were able to learn out of that series of experiences.
Well, the goal was quite simple and direct and pertains to my own life experiences as an African American man. I felt for a long time that the rules, the logics of research, the rules, the logics of sociology really prevented a more complicated, a more enriched story about black males from surfacing. And I would go back and forth as a graduate student. I went to graduate school at the University of Chicago, between learning the formal methods of inquiry and thinking about the conversations I had with men in barbershops and on street corners and wherever I had them. And it occurred to me that there was something else going on for these men that didn't seem to fit in with the survey tradition, or even if it was qualitative inquiry, the formal ways in which that work unfolded. So that men were, and this is coming out of the 80s, the early 90s, when the sense of black men in urban America was ripe with images of violence and hostility. So, what's going on in America in these cities? And whatever's going on, black men are central in the destruction of city life and what have you. And I certainly saw a lot of that and understood a lot of that. I thought that there was just more going on, because I would talk to men, and they'd raise issues or questions about religion, about money, about family, and it just seemed to me that it all fit together in their lives, but didn't seem to serve as any research. So I wanted to, with that work in particular, really have extensive conversations. I felt that the men that had otherwise been depicted as of the underclass, of the highly marginalized, what have you, could explain themselves more fully in a research endeavor that really asked them to explain themselves. But I was careful to want to ground the conversation around some specifics so that I could provide analysis. And I thought, well, what seems to be the issue of the day is their disconnection from work. And all the policy arguments, or the sociology arguments, were that these guys aren't in jobs, so everything is going wrong for them because they're not in jobs. So I thought, well, as a first order concern, let me ask them about work. What is meaningful about work? What do they understand to be work and work prospects? How do they understand that opportunities unfold in society? What do they even envision to be opportunities? And again, this falls back on a life experience where by the time I was in graduate school, many of my friends in my old community in East Harlem knew that I was off studying for long periods of time something. They had no clue what sociology was. They thought I was becoming a social worker, that I was going to get some license and practice somewhere. They knew I was interested in black men and improving their situations. So social, that must be it. I'm going to be, a licensed person in some center someplace doing things with black men. And the whole idea of the professoriate, of a research career, just was beyond them. And I thought, wow, what else might men not understand or grasp? What is it they see and don't see about opportunity mobility? That's what I wanted to bring to the table. And I was inspired to do so because I thought that in sociology, some of these conversations were happening, but not around black men. I had the unique opportunity to encounter a number of visitors from European universities that were interested in what we consider cultural sociology and how people make meaning. But of course, they weren't thinking about black men in urban America. There was all kinds of other populations. And I thought, well, gee, that very approach seemed to be the missing link in studying black men. So I wanted to understand how they made meaning, but around the social worlds they were a part of. And I wanted to essentially formalize the conversations I had with men all the time on the subways, on the street corner. And so the objective was, on the one hand, to give voice, but on the other hand, to say that the research tradition that have been trying to look at incentives and how much must we pay men to go to work, or sanctions, what do we got to do to prevent them from doing other things, that a different conversation had to be brought to the table, which was what they imagined to be the social world in the first place. And why they thought what was there, and perhaps why some things that are there for other people weren't there for them. And that was the objective of that work. So to take men that had been thoroughly studied as far as what they do in the gangs and the underground economy, and just simply say, tell me about how you think the world works around opportunity.
So I'm hearing a couple of different things here, each of which I think is really important. One piece of what I'm hearing is that you're saying that this group of people, but probably it applies to almost every group of people, that the way that they think about the world, the way that they confront their own experience is complex and nuanced. And to understand it, it's not enough to have rational choice, for example. You talked about the incentives. It's not enough to have this kind of schematic picture of how marginalized black men think, but you really need to dig into it. You need to ask the questions and learn how this group of people or that group of people think.
Exactly.
So that's one half of what I'm hearing. And the other half I'm hearing has to do with stereotypes. That we as a culture think we know what Native Americans think or young black men think or whatever. And you didn't exactly say this, but I think we would probably agree, a lot of those assumptions are really just fundamentally wrong.
Exactly. And I think our contemporary moment where through the internet and other forms of technology, we can just get pictures of everything. If we want to understand what's going on in Tanzania today, just log on and something will come up. That there for many of us is this sense that we figured it out or understand people that we otherwise are not in connection with in any sustained way.
Right.
And to me, that was another fascinating thing about higher education, the professoriate, is that we become experts, not all of us, but many through reading and theorizing, but not through human contact. And I just found it provocative that people would talk about populations they really had no contact with, but may have read the latest great 10 books on a set of people or sort of circumstances. And I found that phenomenal. What do you really know if you haven't engaged them?
Mm-hmm. So part of this is, you called it cultural sociology. I guess you could also refer to it as being kind of ethnographic. And to me, it has something in common also with people like Garfinkel and Irving Goffman. Do you think there's an affinity there? Or?
Indeed. One of the things I did early in my career was read very broadly the sociologists that did qualitative work, broadly construed. And I thought, well, there are a number of different projects going on here. There are some folks that just stand still and observe. There are some that interact with the people they're observing. There's some that just talk. And so I never took as a given that there was one method called qualitative investigation, but many methods and many ways of doing qualitative investigation. And some just pay attention to what people say and how sentence structure unfolds.
Right.
And so I thought, okay, there are these various approaches, not one approach.
Right.
And I thought carefully about what I wanted to do, how it related to other qualitative approaches, how even some ideas. And I was very informed by comparative historical research in terms of the theory coming out of it, although I don't do comparative historical research myself. But this question that change is always upon us, and that you can't hold the world static and think that you can ever understand that. Well, I couldn't argue about how precisely that factors into how I do my work, but I took it as sort of a premise that I'd always keep in mind, that every interview would uncover something different, that I'm never getting the final answer to anything. And so across qualitative methods, I've tried to unpack and pull from that which could inform what I'm doing. Goffman, in fact, is someone who I'm very close to in the sense that it was in reading his work that I came to this notion of frame. And this notion that people can offer logics for how the world works, a frame about reality. And I thought, aha, okay, that's a device I'll use. And I know there's a lot of debate about what a frame is and what framing is, but that was the first time where I had a concept that seemed to be about what I was trying to do in talking to men.
So one time when I think commentators are very ready to hear what you're saying is when there are outbreaks of social unrest.
Oh, yeah.
So the London riots a year or two ago, the Stockholm riots in Sweden just in the last few months, where suddenly much of society is just suddenly baffled. Why are these young people behaving as they are? At that point, there's a lot of interest in understanding really what are people thinking about? What are these young people thinking about? Yeah. But in more normal times, it kind of subsides. There's less interest, basically. And I think what you're kind of reminding us is we won't be able to understand those times of crisis if we don't have a better baseline understanding of what's important, what are the limitations, what are the obstacles. So to me, it's very, very important work that you're doing. One thing that I noticed in the book was that you kind of made a virtue of the fact that it's a relatively small number of interviews that you did, but they were very extensive. They were more like conversations than structured interviews with a list of questions. Maybe you could talk about that feature.
And indeed, I rather than have structured questions, I thought of themes or issues I want to explore. And it occurred to me that men respond differently. I'm dealing with a population that has different ways of expressing, these men have different ways of expressing themselves, different understandings of some basic terms. So I thought, have questions that would allow me to know what topics I want to explore, but have the space to let them talk in a way that made sense to them. And so it was never the case of asking the same man the exact same question, or many men, but rather wanting to get at, why they thought, whether they thought race was important in society, and if so, how. What they viewed as a good job and how one got a good job. What benefits exist for being a black man? What detriments exist? So there were certain thematics that I was attentive to. But I realized that, again, thinking about the kind of conversations I had in everyday circumstances, that people understood words differently, that people used language to convey different things, and sometimes said a lot and not talking at all. It was gestures. And I said, okay, I got to figure out how am I going to have a way to capture as much of this as I can.
No, that's really, really cool, really interesting. There are a couple of things that stand out for me from the book, but one was the interest that you had in questioning what is your opinion about race and about racism. And you came to kind of an unusual or an unexpected conclusion. And I'm talking about basically the people who seemed the most isolated actually were the least concerned. Right,
which was a shock to me, and it made me, again, think about my own background in that, although born and raised in East Harlem, I grew up a half a mile from what was then the divide between a more privileged part of Manhattan and my community. And it meant that I had a visible sense of what privilege was. I could literally look out my window and see high-rises that very soon after my early childhood, Donald Trump bought. So I could see Trump's space, outside my window. And so my realization later on in my work was that where you are geographically means a whole lot about what you can talk about. And I initially went into my project assuming that all black men would have a lot to say about race because we've all seen privilege somewhere whether it's outside our window or downtown. So, we've seen difference, we've seen privilege, we've been able to compare ourselves with that. And I went to Chicago thinking that would be the case. And couldn't, in the beginning, understand how men seemed challenged to talk about race.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought there was something wrong with interview instruments. I'm asking the wrong questions, although I said, well, what could be wrong with, tell me if race matters? What other way can you tackle race than by asking questions like that? And was assisted by my then girlfriend, now wife. And she said, well, rather than wrestle with what they're not saying or what they're saying that shocks you, think about who's saying what you expect. And what's the difference between those men and the men that are saying something else? Mm-hmm. And that's when this notion of experience and where you stand in space really loomed large. And I said, wow, the guys who can talk about race, well, actually more like me. They've had contact with the privileged world. Mm-hmm. And these guys that aren't saying a whole lot, they've just been in their neighborhoods. And even unlike Chicago, or rather unlike New York, or at least the part of New York that I'm from, racial isolation in Chicago is an immense problem. You can be in a neighborhood and be miles away from seeing anyone other than the people that you're a part of. Where, again, I was a half mile of privilege. I mean, the next subway stop, where wealthy folks, got off the train. So that's when it all came to me, that space matters, that contact matters, that you may be able to say in very general or preliminary fashion what's going on in the world. But once you have exposure to people, once you have moments of interaction, that's when the substance comes into play. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the critical issue then was not simply looking at what men say, but looking at how much they talk about something, what it means to them not to say something at all. And you only know that sense of meaning or power when you have somebody else saying something. Mm-hmm. And it really shaped for me an approach to research. Because I think prior to that moment, I thought that you just sort of dealt with the conversation that you got in interview research. The question was, what do people say, what does it mean? But this whole notion of what might people not say, or what might they say without much elaboration, then became critical for me. Mm-hmm. So it had, from that moment on, never been simply a gathering of what people say and what that means. It's what you have the capacity to talk about. Right. By virtue of what you've seen, what you've experienced, where you are in the world.
Which really kind of validates the title that you chose, Inside the Minds of Marginalized Black Men, with the idea that you're kind of probing, I mean, the way you just put it was really very eloquent, but it's kind of probing both what's there, but also what's absent, and the absences are also very important. I remember you in the book talking about the fact that some of the young men that you talked with who were most articulate and also most angry about race relations were people who'd had maybe a service job in the loop or had been in prison, and therefore had relationships across race, which
intimate connection with power differentials that were racialized for them. Mm-hmm. They saw white people in positions of privilege, in some cases directing their lives, right? Prison guards or the police, and that led to a very clear sense for them of how race operated and why and what it meant. Mm-hmm.
A couple months ago, I guess 6 or 8 months ago, you gave a really excellent talk in New Detroit about the work that you were doing with young Detroit men, and you told a couple of stories about experiences which some of these young men had in the work world. Yes. I believe you made the point that out of a dozen young people that you were talking with, maybe 8 of them had never had a job. Right. Which maybe is consistent with what you found in Chicago as well. Exactly.
Although at the Detroit level, it's almost like a citywide phenomenon. Mm-hmm. There's a feeling that if you're in that city, you were already excluded from the social worlds that many people that go to work experience, that you were already excluded from an interracial experience that might reflect what other people in other parts of the country experience. Mm-hmm. So it was almost like, doing the Chicago neighborhood focus in a larger context. Mm-hmm. And also a sense, though, that people were feeling a sense of being stigmatized by being from Detroit. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Chicago, it might have been, well, if you're from this part of town, right? But for the Detroit men, it was, I'm from Detroit, and that has a meaning for the rest of the world that's already problematic. And I found that fascinating to feel that, one had to defend the city they're from.
Well, that's or at least,
react to that rather than just being able to say, this is where I'm from.
Right. So you, in your conversations, you kind of focused on work and aspiration, and I think one of the questions you ask is, what would be a good job?
Yes.
What do you look forward to? Yeah. And I suppose there are lots of other topics you could talk about. Family would be another kind of topic, and there are probably, another half dozen topics that would be interesting and probably surprising as well. Mm-hmm. Surprising meaning kind of challenging of stereotype and assumption. You, right at the beginning of the conversation, you talked about the assumptions that a lot of America, maybe a lot of white America, makes about violence and drugs and so forth. And that was not primarily your experience. Violence and fear of violence comes into your story at various points, but the men you were dealing with were not themselves violent men on the whole.
Well, some were. I mean, I was certainly involved with them in moments where they didn't necessarily surface. And it's been the case for the nearly 500 men I've studied now in almost 20 years of research. More than half have been incarcerated. More than half have admitted to being in violent encounters. Right? So I think that violence is certainly a part of the population I deal with. And in the Chicago work, about a third had some, formal incarceration around activity. Not always violent, but been exposed. And in Detroit, roughly half of the men. So violence is there, but I am deliberately trying to tell a different kind of story. And I've tried to say that in not focusing on violence, I don't mean to say that violence doesn't matter. But I've tried to say that there's a whole lot behind what enables people to engage violence. And the best examples that I draw from are just informal conversations I've had with veterans of the military who are charged with being violent. Now, it may be to protect the nation. I get that. So there's no moral judgment on what they've done. But my claim has been that there are a whole lot of factors that go into the capacity of someone to fire a gun. And so it's not unusual for someone to fire a gun. If it's in Iraq, there are circumstances why. If it's in Detroit, there are circumstances why. And of course, we make our judgment about what is legitimate, what's not, what's fair, what's not, what's immoral, what's not. But as many times as I've heard people say, well, what would make somebody do that? It's clear to me that there are circumstances that make a lot of us do a lot of things. I've met veterans that are not proud of some things they've done in combat. Some of which had nothing to do with advancing the United States' interests. But in circumstances where you are threatened or feel insecure or what have you, you do things. And so part of my argument there has been to say that black men don't own violent behavior. They're certainly read as violent in some ways, but they don't own violence. It is a public property, a social property, a social act. And the question is what makes people engage at some moments and not at others. And by virtue of the military experience that I talk about, the recognition that a whole lot of us are capable of engaging violence if in particular circumstances.
So the part that to me is so striking about the interviews of yours, or the kind of excerpts of interviews, I've never read your raw interviews, is you kind of make the point that the assumptions and stereotypes that a lot of commentators and maybe white Americans make just don't come out in the conversations that you're having, that the conversations are nuanced, they're kind of normal, it's about ordinary concerns. One thing I remember you talking about, or reporting, is the fact that it's a different kind of fact about violence, the fact that the men you're talking to are often the subject of violence, and that just getting from point A to point B is a scary thing. So there's a kind of openness and vulnerability and willingness to share their own experience with you, which is very humanizing. It kind of undermines that idea, the black stranger on the corner is probably a scary person. Exactly.
And again, it goes into what I've seen in the neighborhoods that I've lived in and was raised in, and what I know about people. I'm fascinated by how particular acts or particular circumstances can allow the same person to be read in different ways. Someone that's violent prone or seen as a threat is somebody else's brother or neighbor or friend. And the same body. And so I try to capture some of that in this work too. And again, it's about fighting stereotypes, but doing so by not disavowing aspects that cause some people problems, but saying there's just so much more to who a person is. So much more.
So one thing that a lot of social scientists want to find somehow is an ability to have at least limited generalizations from their work. And I suppose that a person reading your book would say, there are some generalizations here, but it's a tricky thing to do because it's a small number of individuals, each of whom is different from the other. So I wonder, kind of how you think about the challenge of generalization.
Very much what you said in the end captures the core generalization that I want to make, that people are different. And I say that in a public conversation that captures black men in such similar fashion. So just trying to advance that there's diversity of outlook, opinion, ideas is the first generalization that I want. This population is not consistent of people who behave the same way, who act the same way, who importantly think the same way. Even if they may do some similar things, the thinking behind it may be so complicated and so diverse that we've got to register. Right. So that is the core generalizability. Attached to that is, again, what I've said before, that people in general, can't wholly be understood by what they do. The other part of the human experience is what you think about. And not every thought translates into action. Although, all of our actions are in some ways tied to our thoughts, or else we wouldn't, engage those actions. And I really try to surface that there's room in sociology in particular. I mean, this whole notion of thought is not just a property of psychology or philosophy or other fields, but there's some sociological significance to paying attention to thought. Right. And so that's the other generalizability. And it's not just for black men, but for people.
No, that's. I think that's really, really excellent. One of the kind of philosophy of social science points that I've been making in my own thinking for the last couple of years is that sociology and the social sciences really need a much better theory of the actor. And to have a theory of the actor is really to have a theory of how people think and process and recognize and frame the experiences which they have, and then also how they're motivated. And it's kind of an opinion of my own, anyway, that a lot of sociology and a lot of political science moves too quickly to a very simple theory of the actor. And I think what you're calling for is a much denser, much richer theory of the actor.
And one that leaves space to talk across disciplinary boundaries. So that I think about psychology and anthropologists all the time in what I'm doing. And I can't say that I've figured out exactly all the points of connection, but I do think there are moments in psychology, particularly cognitive psychology, where my work then answers what happens in the social space. Right? The internal processing, beyond my capacity as a researcher. But I know there's something there, and those folks are doing work there. But then that's got to come together with what happens for the actor in the social world, who then takes account of that world and is affected by that world, and what becomes the articulated thought.
Right. And that's one reason why I think Goffman is relevant, because Goffman does have some language for talking about how people process social situations, whether it's rules or frames or drama. And what's really interesting to me about all of that is that it makes the whole kind of system of person in social world much more complex. And so it's kind of hard to know, how to get an angle on it. And yet, if the world is complex, then we need to have complex representations of the world.
Indeed.
So in other words, we need to do the kind of work that you're talking about. As you were talking about the importance of thinking about thinking, or thinking about social thinking, I was kind of thinking, well, this is maybe you might call it cognitive sociology, except that it's not all about cognition. It's also about feeling and about emotion and commitment and... So to have a developed theory of the actor is actually a very challenging thing to do.
And it is my hope that sometime late in my career I could offer not necessarily the thesis, but advance that conversation. Given all the complexities involved, I don't feel that anytime soon I'm prepared to do so. But I'd love 20 years from now to be able to make some concrete claims about that inform a theory of the actor. But I appreciate the time and intensity involved in doing something like that, and don't envision anytime soon I'll get there. I recognize that's work to be done. That's a conversation I'm going to be a part of.
There's a piece of sociology which I guess I would call the new pragmatism, which is I think that kind of subdiscipline is thinking hard about different theories of action, theories of the actor, but more inspired by pragmatism than by deliberative rationality. And the idea that a lot of what people do is in a sense habitual, or is a learned set of responses to the world, which sounds a little bit more like frames than it does like, well, here's a goal that I have, and I'll kind of rationally figure out how to pursue that goal. Well, this is really, really interesting and important work. Where do you think you would go from here?
I'm trying to actually look from something like the same lens at a set of other concerns. So you said earlier that the work that I do doesn't fully address family, but it's kind of, connected to it. Right now, I'm very interested in family. I'm very interested in how black men think about fatherhood, particularly black men who have not had fathers in a household. So how do you envision a role that, in many cases, is a part of your life that you didn't benefit from experiencing as a young child? What does it mean to be charged with operating in a way that you've not had intimate connection with? And hence, what does that mean for notions of family? And that's tied to another particularity around these men in that if they were raised, and in many cases were raised in single female-headed households, how did they then think about the status and role of men in family when literally all the parenting was done by a woman?
Right.
And so what does that mean for you imagining who you are, what you should do? And again, I stand back from normative claims. Even this body of work that I'm now beginning to enter more fully isn't predicated upon a notion of trying to preserve a status of a man as a head of household. That would be a foolish statement to make back to the history of the African American experience, where women have always worked and, at least in the last 50 years, been heads of household. There's the only head of a household more than men. And so the question for me is not trying to restore some image, but really just understand how men make sense of a role they had to step into or place themselves into that they haven't been able to experience in any rich way.
It's really interesting that you say that. I had a conversation within the last 6 months with an African-American woman, professional, mother of, I think about a 12-year-old, with an African-American husband. What she shared with me was that she and her husband were really struggling with exactly this question, that each of them had been raised by a single-parent, female-headed household, and they're both trying to figure out, what is the role for the dad.
It's a community issue, right?
And it's not. I didn't have the impression that it was at all conflictual, but it's really literally what kind of patterns can we develop that are healthy, kind of growth-inducing patterns.
Precisely.
So it's really interesting that you're willing to work on that.
And what also makes this sociologically relevant is not simply the question of a vacancy in being raised in a household without a father, but if you're from a community setting where the norm is that young people had no fathers around, it's a social role you haven't seen operate in that space. So therein lies the sociology above and beyond the family. It's a community issue. If fatherhood is not a part of the community or it's the unique experience, then how do you make sense of this model that's not at home or amongst your peer group?
Which actually takes me back a little bit to the pragmatist line that a lot of our behaviors are learned by example of our own personal experience or the experience of other families or other people around us. And if there's a certain area. Well, for example, in my campus, we spend a certain amount of time working with students with disadvantaged backgrounds in terms of that next step into the work world and learning things which you might say, well, a university doesn't have to teach that, like how to dress for an interview or how to present yourself at a dinner. And yet, if you haven't had that experience, you haven't learned that.
You have no clue.
Which is kind of, it is sort of a vindication of that idea of the pragmatist line that we're effective in social life to the extent that we've mastered some of these routines.
And of course, I sort of come up to the point of saying what ideas we have reflect what we've been exposed to. So the behavior is, certainly linked to that. But as a researcher,
Right. Well, that's what's interesting. I would call those habits part of the mind. They're not necessarally conscious parts of the mind, but they're part of the apparatus that leads us to behave in this way rather than that way.
Certainly.
I want to take a little bit of a turn to the left. I guess it's not the political left, but just a little bit of deviation in the conversation. You and I have talked a little bit about your own personal childhood, your family, your growing up in Harlem, the high school experience you had. It's all really, really interesting. What I was hoping you'd do is talk about that a little bit, and then we could maybe probe how that rolls out into your academic interest.
And it is crystal clear to me today, although not always at the time of my rearing, that I've got a unique experience relative to many black males. So having been born and raised in a highly impoverished urban community, but in a family where my father was a white-collar professional and a college graduate. And mom had some exposure to college, but no degree. And so, born in a family of a father that was really a beneficiary of affirmative action. Certified public accountant, bachelor's degree, didn't go beyond that. Had his first job in a predominantly white accounting firm. I was too young to even remember him ever working there. But early in the 70s, joined an African-American firm that at one point was the largest firm in the United States, the largest African-American accounting firm in the United States of America, and would partner with larger firms to get contracts. So my growing up, I came to understand my father as being a part of this black professional circle that very early on benefited from affirmative action. He was always associated with privileged black folks. He'd bring home an autograph every couple of months of New York Knicks players, politicians, that he encountered. Yet the neighborhood we lived in was chronically impoverished. And I assumed that there were other black folks like me in these kind of spaces. There must be a black lawyer's child somewhere out there. But there were very few. The handful that were lived in the residential community that I lived in, because it was designed to be a mixed income residential complex. It ended up being essentially more working class with a few white collar professionals in there, but none of my father's stature. I mean, no one anywhere close to where he was. But the best example that I tell people about what it meant to live in that environment is my father in the mid-'70s made partner of his firm. He bought a Continental, a black Lincoln Continental, as sort of his gift to himself for having made partner. And he parked this car in the only 24-hour secure parking structure in our neighborhood, which is about a half mile from the home. So a 24-hour attendant. And it seemed normal at the time, but some years afterwards I thought, what was this all about? But on the coldest winter days in New York, snowy days, we'd take a cab to the parking structure to get the car to go on a family outing. And it seemed to make perfect sense then. But at some point, I said, well, who does that? But it's precisely what one does in a family that is relatively secure in a community where that security didn't exist. And I just thought, wow, that explains what was going on for me. But at the time, I felt like I was living a life where I certainly had more benefits than a lot of folks that I knew. I was exposed to a lot of people, but I played in the same community. I played amongst the same people. My friends were there. I certainly felt more privileged. And I think I had some of the accoutrements. I mean, I dressed a little differently. I was always a little different than the folks in the neighborhood. But that's the world that I knew. And when the crack epidemic unfolded in Harlem, particularly East Harlem in the 1980s, I witnessed that and, saw things become really dangerous and really problematic. And like everybody else in the neighborhood, made some adaptations to that. So you knew there were certain blocks that were worse than other blocks. And you knew certain people were involved in things. And I remember always making judgments about that. And even, leaving the subway to walk home. If it was 10 p.m., I'd take a certain route versus 5 p.m. And those kind of things that you just adapt as ways of function were all a part of my life experience. But having said that, I always went to good schools. In the third month of my first grade experience, I was in a neighborhood public school. The teacher told my mother he's not going to learn in this environment. You got to get him out of here. If you raise this with the principal, I'll deny it and you'll make an enemy out of me for life. But I'm telling you, he's got to go. 24 hours later, I was in a Catholic school in downtown Manhattan, where the biggest neighbor was Richard Nixon, who, when he left the White House, bought a brownstone across the street from my elementary school. So that's the world I was a part of from the fourth month of first grade through all of my elementary school years. Catholic school educated in some of the richest parishes in New York City, but came from East Harlem, to that space. And was in many ways the best kind of student to make that transition because the schools knew that I was from a family with a college-educated father. So I was the perfect African American to be amongst the first in these environments. I was the closest to what that world understood. And so, the transition was easy then, or at least easy from my point of view. I knew a lot of other African American students in my schooling experience who didn't do as well, or, went there and left. But I was able to navigate that space, do okay. Went to a very competitive Catholic high school that, again, drew a lot of children of privilege. Relative to Catholic high schools, I mean, we certainly weren't as privileged as the elite private high schools in New York City, but well-to-do student body and a very good environment. And then had black students there, most of whom were not as economically privileged as I was. We knew there was a difference in that space, but I related well to them, and many of them are my best friends today. But that was the life growing up. So I always felt like I figured out the city, figured out urban communities, knew what was going on there, knew those people, but had access to pockets of privilege and opportunity that were unique for a black male.
I kind of wonder about that. I want to continue the narrative, but I do kind of wonder about whether there's a kind of communications. You're basically saying you were raised in two communities.
Yeah.
And so you were kind of bilingual across the
Oh, yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Whereas if you had told me that your father made a decision that a lot of African-American professionals did not make, and that was to stay in Harlem. If you'd moved to the north suburbs of New York,
which is where his colleagues were from his firm.
Maybe you would not have had that facility.
I don't think so at all.
The, the kind of more working class inner city.
I don't think so at all.
So it's almost like multiple cultural competences that you're able to gain.
And some challenges too. I mean, I remember in high school, a number of my friends very early on were shocked when they found out what neighborhood I was from. They assumed I was one of those few blacks that lived in downtown Manhattan in all white communities. And I remember bringing two of them who lived in the South Bronx called me one day and said, want to stop by for a visit. I said, never gonna, but fine. It must have been a professional basketball game on playoff time or something. So I told them what subway stop to take. They got on the subway and said, you live here? And it just shocked them. I mean, it looked like their neighborhood.
These were white kids?
No, African Americans. But the sense that because, again, I was from a more privileged background, they figured I was one of those blacks, one of those few that lived closer to, they didn't think I lived. And in fact, my neighborhood was, from a socioeconomic point of view, more impoverished than theirs. Uh-huh. And so they were just, I remember the walk from the subway station to my apartment building. And they're just looking around like almost in a total state of shock. He comes from here. And ultimately, for a few years into high school when other friends would come, they got it all clear by junior year, what have you. But early on, there was some sense. So there's always been some moments of challenge or questioning, or, for me, the fact that to this day I've never played golf. So there's something about certain forms of privilege that have escaped me. I've never desired to play golf. Did not grow up in a house, so the whole question of home ownership and even cutting the grass, that's something I learned to do until I was an adult. So there was some moments of being distant from privilege, but also being distant from poverty and racialized poverty too. Mm-hmm. So there was both patterns of exposure, but moments of difference too.
Right. So it often seems to be the case. Now let me just think about the white community that. Relatively professional and privileged children, let's say high school kids, don't really have much facility in relating to or communicating with blue-collar kids. Yeah. That there's the class separation seems to extend to communication and play and who relates to whom. Yep. Does that seem right to you?
Oh, yeah. It came to surface quite clearly in my high school, where there was a working class white element, a very strong ethnic element, right? A privileged white element, because we were on a commuter line where students from the northern suburbs could actually come. My high school was on the campus of Fordham University. So even though it was in the Bronx, you didn't have to experience the Bronx. You got off at the Fordham stop. Mm-hmm. That was on the Fordham University campus and went to high school, so you didn't have to experience the neighborhood in any way. Mm-hmm. So we had a good number of privileged students, and then African American students and Latino students.
It's very interesting. I was reading Loic Wacant's ethnography of the Fight Club. Yeah. And what I'm finding really interesting in reading it is the process of kind of, gelling of this French guy with this African American group of young men and the coaches and so forth. And it seems like a really hard transition to make for basically for anybody who's not of a culture to be incorporated. It does seem in reading your the Marginalized Black Men book that somehow it seems like an important part of your ability to do that work comes from the fact of this kind of bilingual experience.
Indeed. I feel perfectly equipped to translate something about these men's experiences to this other world. Mm-hmm. That's in large part how I define what I'm doing as a researcher.
Mm-hmm. And so this is of a lot of interest to me. So the experience you had, which was kind of two cultural, two meaning bicultural experience, that left you with some kind of intellectual personal skills, which allowed you to kind of bridge cultures. I wonder if it also gave you some commitments, some kind of passionate interest.
And that comes from my father, because I at the same time that I was thinking about taking that cab to the parking lot to get the car, I was curious, so why did you stay? What was going on there? And my dad had always been involved as a sort of background player in political affairs. So he was for many years the personal accountant to David Dinkins, the first and only black mayor of New York City. So that was a childhood friend, and there was a sense of deliberately being committed to social causes and social issues. And so at the same time that I began thinking, wow, I had a unique experience relative to other people from East Harlem, I thought about my father's choice not to make certain decisions, or not to pursue certain paths that others of his economic status did. And in many ways, I see myself as following his lead in being close to people. One of the things that I most appreciate about my father is that he never lost the capacity to talk to folks from the neighborhood. And he always seemed to evaluate people irrespective of their economic status. There's some privileged folks he couldn't stand, and some poor folks he couldn't stand, and some poor folks he loved, and some rich folks he loved. And it became clear to me that he never had the economic divide as being critical to how he made sense of people. And that's something that I'm aware I conscientiously embraced from him. And even his own style. I mean, the man, when he passed away, which was in 1993, by that time my parents had split, so he had his own apartment in Central Harlem. I was cleaning out his apartment. He had 30 unopened dress shirts in his wardrobe. I mean, some department stores don't have that many shirts available. And I thought, why is the man with a lot of resource? But his favorite thing to do was go to the corner delicatessen in my neighborhood and eat a sandwich standing up by the counter. Not a thing a lot of white-collar professionals do, but I used to love these sandwiches, just standing eating these sandwiches. And that just impressed me. I said, here's a man who doesn't allow his economic status to dictate just how he operates. He loves some of the finer things by virtue of buying a whole lot of clothing he never had a chance to wear. But a good old roast beef sandwich at the corner deli was, better than many steaks, lobster for him, And I'm aware that, both consciously and subconsciously, I've embraced a lot of that from him. I mean, a slice of pizza is my favorite food today, but I like a good glass of wine too. So.
Like a Pinot Noir and a really rich piece of pizza. So would you say that your father's decision to stay in East Harlem, was that kind of a political, racial decision?
I think in part. I never really asked him. I asked my mother, and she was so disappointed by never having gotten the white picket fence that she couldn't really give me an answer about why Dad did what he did. So I really don't have a full sense of that, but yeah, I do know that his sense of civic awareness was so strong. He was active in the community, again, active with politicians, and so something about not making that break was real important for him. And in some ways, in an odd sense, his having moved from the South Bronx where he was raised to East Harlem, even though he actually moved into a more economically depressed community, he was living a life much better than where he was. In many ways, it was a step up. I mean, particularly, he was born and raised in a tenement building in the South Bronx, and I saw the building before it was demolished. And I thought, who in the world would live there? Or at least in East Harlem, we were in an apartment building.
Right.
3 bedrooms. I mean, it was pretty spacious relative to what most folks in the lower neighborhoods have. So
sometimes you have the impression in a city like Detroit, I haven't spent enough time in Chicago to speculate about Chicago, that there's maybe not as great a relationship between the affluent professional black community and the low-income black community. That there's kind of a tension between them. Would you say that that's...
I think so. I mean, for Chicago, because the spatial difference is such, Harlem is interesting in that there may be particular blocks of privilege, but they're surrounded by blocks of poverty. Even the apartment my father moved into when my parents split up was on a block. Actually, the owner of the building was a multimillionaire. 2 or 3 of the tenants were his children who were doing very well. 2 blocks away was just abject poverty. I mean, streets I wouldn't walk down at night. And Chicago wasn't quite that same mix. So again, this whole question of where you are, who you see is so critical. There are ways in which Harlem facilitated a kind of connection and relationship that I didn't quite see in Chicago. Even some of the gated communities in Detroit, there's that distance. Right.
So I think a part of the question is, who do you identify with? And I guess I'm kind of wondering about the black professional. Does he identify with the children of the urban poor, or does he kind of think, they should try harder? And
I do think there is a strong class divide, and answering it personally, I'm clear where I belong in terms of my economic and cultural status. I've often felt closer to less privileged folks.
It's interesting where that comes from. I think that actually brings me to another point that I was hoping to get to, and that is how, and I think it's a topic of interest to you as well, how a person's intellectual life, intellectual agenda, intellectual passions, how they take shape over time. I think it's pretty clear from this conversation, previous conversations, that a lot of your current interests really do go back a very long time. Go back to these experiences you've been talking about. Do you have any thoughts about, kind of the sociology of becoming an intellectual?
Well, yeah. I mean, in my case, I found, having been raised where I raised, again, I was exposed to a lot of black professionals, but I never met anyone that I could recall being a professor. I met a lot of lawyers and doctors and engineers and politicians. Never met a professor, at least that I knew of. But I was aware that there were these folks in universities called doctor. And I was baffled. I said, they're not helping anybody get healthy. Why are these folks doctors? And it wasn't until I got to college that I thought there was a professional space to think about all these things that intrigued me for a while. So I almost thought of some of these ideas as just sort of, hobbies or things to reflect upon. People that sort of got interest or things that they wonder about. For me, these sort of issues, black men and what's going on with them, they were things to ponder. And when I got to college, it seemed to me that there was a space to make a life out of this. I met professors, particularly one African-American professor, who I thought, I want to be like this guy. Again, being unique, I actually went to college already deciding I was going to be a civil rights attorney. So I thought, service mattered to me. I had some experiences as a high school student that made me think a lot about being of service to African Americans. I had my father's example. His best friends were all very credentialed people that were in Harlem doing service work, including his best friend, who was a Harvard graduate, an African American graduate of Harvard Law School in the late 50s or early 60s. So one of very, very few who spent his entire career either working as a staff attorney for Martin Luther King or in Harlem. And so I thought, this is a man who could have been extraordinarily wealthy, and in fact was hired, including the owner of the building my father lived in, was hired with some black millionaires to do some work for them. But essentially, day to day, was of service to the community. I thought, I got to do something like that. So civil rights law seemed to be the thing. And so I spent all of my freshman year saying, I'm going to be a civil rights attorney. But in the college experience, I thought, wow, there's a career for people that want to think and write. And so this is what I want to do. And again, it was because I met a black professor that just seemed to me to capture all this. He was a guy that was perfectly content with being a thinker and a writer and a teacher. I said, aha, that's it. And I challenged myself. I deliberately did an internship after my junior year at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Saying, all right, that's where the best civil rights attorneys in America around black issues are. I'm going to hang out with them for a summer and know when it's over that I still want to do this. I want to do the academic thing. And I left that summer thinking, I respect what they do, but boy, we need some more research on black people and black men in particular. So that was the internship that cemented for me the sense that I was going in the right direction. And also, in terms of my contact with this individual, he did something I've never heard of in terms of exposure to academia. When I informed him that I was thinking about, I said, I think I want to sort of be like you. Not in every way. We had a very friendly relationship. So I could tease him about his style and what have you. I said, I want to be smart like you, not behave the way you behave. You wear heavy pants in the summertime. So these sort of back and forth jokes we'd make. But what he did is he called about 10 or so people that he knew. And some of them were prominent scholars, Cornel West, John Blassingame, now deceased, a well-known historian. And he arranged meetings for me with these people. And some of this was tied to an honor thesis I was writing as a student on black scholars, because I thought, I'll help work this out by studying these people, sort of, make an academic project, a quick study of these folks to figure out what I want to do. But he called them on the phone and arranged these meetings. So at the beginning of my senior year, every other week or so, I was in the living room or in the office of some of the most prominent or emerging black scholars in America. And chatting with them about who they were and why they did what they did. And so that happened again after the summer in which I did the Legal Defense Fund thing and so I had a rich exposure to and I had no idea at the time who all these folks were and how prominent they'd become, but that was my learning base for figuring out academia and a career in it. And so, I was socialized into the profession in a very particular and unique way. Such that, it was clear to me what world I was getting into and what were the risks and what were the opportunities. But fundamentally, the notion that I could make a living thinking about black folks and writing about them. The one point of tension that serves in the work that I do is that I wanted to remain politically relevant. So even though there are moments where I think about theories or ideas that I'd love to explore at some point, I've committed myself to studying people in crisis or in need and trying to offer arguments, not just to the academy, but to other audiences that matter for them. So this notion of doing something that's relevant for those folks.
So there's one piece of what you just said that seems to be a really interesting parallel to the work that you did with Street Corner Guys, and that is you were talking to these people like Cornel West, trying to figure out and then define for yourself some aspirations and goals and so forth. But it's kind of like you were, at that point as a college student, sort of living out a little bit the inquiries that you eventually did
Indeed.
As a PhD student.
Indeed.
Which I think is really very interesting because it kind of suggests also another role that you perform, and that is to, I think it's a question of a lot of interest to you, how to give kind of a passionate interest in young African American men and women in the idea of being a scholar, a researcher, a professor. And it seems like that's an important thing for you.
Yeah. And I think about that alongside what else or what more must be done, and how my service is complementary to those. So, and I tell young folks all the time, there's certainly not enough of us, but there's not enough of any of us in banking, in medicine, in law. And so, what can I do that complements, what these other folks do? And that provides a measure of comfort in what I do. I mean, I've never assumed that, and I think a lot of researchers do have this notion that, I'm here to change the world. Well, if the world changed with the work that I do, a whole lot of other people, a lot of other capacities have got to pick this work up or be inspired to make change. So it's not up to me alone to do that. That I can maintain conversations with folks in different sectors to make things happen.
But I think that's a very important kind of philosophy of teaching also, that it's not for us to determine what the outcome is for the student. It's really to open up opportunities. But also, part of opening an opportunity is to make it really visible. This is an opportunity.
Indeed.
I had the nice experience, as you know, of teaching a class right after you in this building down the hall, and seeing a large group of mostly African-American, I think mostly undergraduate students, and the enormous enthusiasm they had for the sociology of race, I think was the name of the class. But I would stand outside the door waiting for them, their enthusiasm level to get down to the leave.
They can leave, right?
And I was thinking, what a fabulous opportunity this is for students at the University of Michigan to get so excited about the content and about the person, about the teaching. I thought it was just a really important thing to observe. And somehow I think it lines up with the other piece of work that you do. My daughter had the experience of being in City Year in Cleveland a number of years ago, between college and, actually she was on her way to your alma mater, to Wesleyan.
Really, yeah.
And so between high school and Wesleyan, she took a year and did a year of service in Cleveland. And one of the most, she learned many profound things, but one of the most profound things she learned was her team was, there were 10 kids on the team, probably 8 of them were African-American Cleveland kids. Just wonderful, sweet, committed, smart young people, almost none of whom had the aspiration of college and a profession, simply because that had never been said to them. And I kind of felt through her eyes the loss that represents. That young people with such great talent, would settle for being a stylist
But they can't envision anything else.
Right, exactly.
And even in my position of privilege, I had not known a professor.
Right.
Up until I was 18 years of age, I had not thought this is a possible outcome. Because it just wasn't. So, I fully get why people can't imagine a range of possibilities given where they stand. So.
Right. So, again, that kind of takes us back to, I think, a core piece of your thinking, your imagination as a sociologist, and that is that the subjective side, the part of being a subjective human being, that is actually sociologically very important. It's important to the individual if she can't imagine any career but getting a little bit ahead by getting a cosmetology certificate, in spite of the fact she could be, a math major and become a statistician. But she can't conceive of that because no one has ever said, you can do this, and it's a real career. There is a real job there for you. So that's kind of subjective, but it's also hugely important for social change, that somehow creating more bandwidth to the idea of opportunity and what the real opportunities are for young people. It's just one of the things I kind of got excited about as I think about the way that you approach sociology. What do you think sociology needs to learn in the next 10 years?
I think the discipline needs to grow a little bit more comfortable with what it's done to create so many other forms of knowledge. And I think in some ways I'm answering the question in a way that might surprise you. But what I'm struck by the discipline, and again, it's colored by my experience, because I didn't actually come into sociology through a commitment to being a sociologist. Sociology for me was the widest window on the social world that allowed me to be a little bit of a psychologist, a little bit of anthropologist, a little bit of a historian. So it was for me the social science that allowed me to be a full-fledged social scientist. Having said that, I've been intrigued by how much the discipline has inspired other fields. And so we stand at a moment now where we question who we are, where we fit in, because now there's organizational studies, and public policy, the field of inquiry has emerged, and some universities now have family studies, and there's now criminal justice and criminology, and all these areas that seem to be, if not fully at home, then largely at home in sociology 30, 40 years ago, or what topics in sociology, not intellectual fields in and of themselves. And now it's sort of like, what's left for sociology? I'm not so sure what's left just yet. But I take comfort in the fact that the discipline has encouraged a way of thinking that other fields haven't. And I don't think we've quite articulated yet what that is. Mm-hmm. And if we can do that, then we may be better able to say, here's what we've got to do in the future. Mm-hmm. But something about that articulation means being very clear that we look at issues of structure in a unique way. Mm-hmm. Right? And the structure around, race, class, gender, but structure in so many other ways that we own that conversation in ways that other folks don't. We talk about culture, and other disciplines do too, but in a way that relates to structure, that again is our sort of contribution. And I think at some level we've got to figure out what that's all about. The mistake I think we've made in the field is to say that our durability rests in articulating rigid social laws. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure there's such a thing. I mean, what we do informs the world, and the world responds back to it, and then something else happens, so, what stays the same? The only social law I know of is we're born, we live, we die. Mm-hmm. And maybe for a matter of seconds or a matter of, a century. But, there's nothing else as a law, as far as I'm concerned, beyond that. Mm-hmm. Yet, I think sociology has in the 20th century in some ways today still continues with this notion of we've got to articulate with precision the laws. I think we've got to articulate with precision the kind of vision we have of the world. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that will then give us a space to think about, what we are as a field. But I think we're not quite clear.
So it's interesting that you come back to structure, mm-hmm. because I think of structure as being the opposite pole of the kind of what you call cultural sociology, mm-hmm. which is more agent-centered mm-hmm. or actor-centered. Mm-hmm. But then the big structures of race, the ways in which racial separation, racial segregation work, those have implications for subjectivity, but they work in a kind of impersonal way. And so the study of those mechanisms, those structures, seems really important. It seems important that we understand them better. In a way, it seems like a different question from the questions about the subjectivity of race, the subjectivity of aspiration. Mm-hmm. Not that one is more important than the other, but I wonder if you could link them. Do you think that?
Well, I think they're linked in that I consistently maintain a notion that the structural terrain matters. Mm-hmm. So at the point in time in which, at every point in time in which I'm doing work on urban-based black men, the core structural factor is the urban sphere. Right? What does it mean to be a black man in the city? What does it mean to be a black man in an urban neighborhood? So structure's already there. Right? When I talk about who's had exposure to certain people and who has not, right? Structural factors shape some of that. Mm-hmm. You just don't sort of wake up one day and go out and encounter rich folks. You got to, take the subway or something. Something's got to happen to put you in contact with those folks. And then your life in an urban environment is structured in that if you're in a high-rise public housing development, there are a whole lot of people in limited space that share a condition. If you're socializing in public space in urban communities, that's a structure for the basketball court, the street corner. So structure's always there. Mm-hmm. I am intensively writing about the cultural dynamics, meaning making, what have you. Mm-hmm. But the structure is there, and I may not always bring that into the writing, but it's a given for me. Mm-hmm. I mean, I do think when I study urban-based black men, that's a very different project than studying rural, low-income black men.
Yes.
So
that's right.
Yeah, so structure factors in how I imagine what I do. Right. I just go on with the conversation with concepts, ideas, terms that may pertain to the cultural.
Which makes very good sense from the point of view of almost the division of labor of science or of social science, that you can't handle every question all the time. I'm noticing that you have on your desk a book that I also admire, The Great American City, a book by Robert Sampson, which is also about your city, or at least one of your cities, Chicago. Mm-hmm. And it's much more on the kind of structure side, causation, mechanisms, how neighborhoods are both influenced but also influencers of behavior. And I don't see any contradiction between the perspectives that you take and Robert Sampson takes, but they're different perspectives, which I think is really, really interesting. To me, there's a lot of urgency in the social sciences. I think about this both in the U.S., but I also think in developing countries like India or China, where there are processes underway that are really powerful, really impactful, really, in some sense, dangerous, or at least consequential. And yet, they're processes we don't have good explanations of. We don't have good tools for analyzing how those processes work. The processes I'm most concerned about in this country are about race and poverty, because it seems like so many other issues, we've managed to make some progress. And in the area of impacted poverty in racially segregated central cities, not much progress, maybe no progress. But in China, maybe it's different things. It's rapid urbanization and environmental degradation. But the point I'm getting at is, if I were asked my own question, what should sociology do in the next 10 years, it would be get a lot more kind of aware of the need for innovative thinking about mechanisms, about processes. Don't be too wedded to old theories, but really try to understand today's reality.
Well, we're a discipline that I think has traditionally and contemporarily looked to the past before we get on with, there's no discipline that I can think of that spends so much time reading about figures from before than we do. You're not allowed into the game unless you spend a long time reading about folks that wrote 100 years ago.
Right.
Fascinating for me that's the case. I understand at some level what's at stake there, but at another level, it's like, wow, you're really sort of handicapped in terms of grappling with the future. And there's so much about contemporary social living. Again, the way in which technology plays a role. What does it mean to have a conference where everybody's interfacing through a piece of technology? You can't touch another person. You can't see what else is there. That's different than being 10 folks in the same room. And, we haven't, as a discipline, begun to think about what that means and just how that may be shaping forms of understanding that are so different. I'm not saying we all need to be scholars of the internet, but we do need to think seriously that communication is happening in different ways. Technology has given us the capacity to be in different space in the same day. And with that, I'm often intrigued at something, again, with these sort of, private moments that I have where I think about things. I look at the president's daily schedule. There's some site where you can get on. I'm like, well, this guy can be in 3 cities in the same day and home by dinner. What does that mean compared to someone that's gone down the block to work and then home, right? It's a different way of grappling with reality. It's different, And so many of us then have something in between that, right? And I don't think as a discipline we've, kind of wrestled with what kinds of contact we're having and how it shapes so differently. My son is online every night. And, just what he's getting about my oldest son, right, about the broader world, what he's not. Because it's an assumption that being in contact electronically means something that it may not. But as a discipline, I don't think we've quite embraced those questions yet.
And if you take one specific problem in China, which is rapid urbanization, the marginalization of over 100 million people who are basically on the move looking for jobs that are, in some sense, an improvement over their rural life. It's still pretty awful. And how to even track and kind of make sense, cognitively make sense of the processes of urbanization.
Oh my goodness!
Which, when we say it's urbanization, we think it's one process, but it's actually not. It's a combination of many different processes.
Very different people.
That it just seems like we need to have better ways of analyzing and kind of theorizing, and maybe smaller grain theories, not grand theories like Marx or Weber, but maybe mid-level.
I think so. Yeah. It's certainly. I always tell my students, take small bites. And it's reflective of my own work. Small population to study at a particular point in time, but given how much is going on and how hard it's on top of it,
So there's a role for public sociology, a role for sociological research, which has implications for change in America. That seems like a good place to stop. Al, thank you so much. This has been a terrific conversation. I think a lot of people will find it interesting.
Oh my goodness, quite enjoyable.
And I continue to think the work you're doing on people's mentality, cities, race, and poverty, that's really important work, and I thank you for it.
Well, thank you. And thank you for drawing attention to it. So.
Great. Thanks.